Hi, everyone. Good local time. Good morning from Berlin. Welcome to today's open forum event. The title is the West and Taiwan. So, this is Guangying Liu. I'm the managing editor and the English website editor from Taiwan's Commonwealth magazine, coming to you live from Berlin, where I'm based for a few more weeks. So today we have another star-studded panel. So if you're joining us for the first time regarding Taiwan, welcome. And it'll be even better if you have attended our previous panel discussion about understanding Taiwan. So today we're going to dig even deeper about the issues surrounding Taiwan and the escalating tensions in the Taiwan Strait. So let me give you a short introduction of today's panelists. So first of all, we welcome Jusha Anna Ferenci. She's the assistant professor of National Donghua University in Taiwan. She heads the associate network for Nine Dash Line, a digital platform connecting Europe and the Indo-Pacific, and is a non-resident fellow at Taiwan NextGen Foundation. So she is a former political advisor in the European Parliament for more than 10 years. Welcome, Jusha. Okay, thank you. Yeah. And next it'll be Gigi Mantis Pavilionis. He is the member of the Lithuanian Parliament, is also the international secretary of the ruling Homeland Union Lithuanian Christian Democrat Party in Vilnius. He joined Lithuania's Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1993 and served as the Baltic countries' ambassador to the US between 2010 and 2015. Welcome, Gigi, joining us from Vilnius.
My pleasure.
Yes, from the parliament, actually. The office in the parliament is really beautiful. And last but not least is Antoine Bondas. He's the director of the Taiwan program at the Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique, or the Foundation for Strategic Research, and associate professor at Sciences Po in Paris. He advises senior government officials as well as private entities in France and Europe. Welcome, Antoine.
Good morning and good afternoon to some of you.
Okay, that's good. So why we need to talk about the West and Taiwan today? I think this is really a really interesting time when we see more and more interest from the Western countries, especially the European Union's countries. Lots of delegations visiting Taiwan, and no less, if you remember, actually, just a month ago, the U.S. House Speaker Pelosi was also visiting Taiwan. So, and when I have been in Europe for a little bit over 2 months now, and everyone sees me, they ask me, "Oh, okay, what will happen with Taiwan and China, and why is everybody talking about the tension?" So, I would like to start with a few slides to introduce the topic today. So, why should we care about Taiwan? So, chances are, wherever you are, you're using your computer, your laptop, your smartphone, you're probably driving a car right now, a smart car, the smart technologies that we cannot live without today. All of them, almost all of them, rely on this one company that, a year ago, probably nobody has ever heard of. It's called TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. Why is it so important? Please, the next slide. Yeah, because it's really punching above its weight in the chip industry. Some industry statistics estimated that over half of the world's chip supply manufacturing come from or have something to do with this one company, which has most of its production capacity in Taiwan. So that's actually a pretty surprising number. If you look at this chart, you will see that in the chip industry, the biggest players that you probably haven't really heard of, many of them come from Taiwan. So first on the chart is TSMC, followed by Samsung. So it's a strong competitor of TSMC, and followed by UMC. It's United Microchip. It's a Taiwanese company, and then you have Global Foundries from the US, and then you have two Chinese companies, followed by other two Taiwanese companies. So it's a really according to some estimates, if you talk about the advanced microchips, over 90% of them come from Taiwan. So that's actually a very staggering number. So if you could go to the next slide, please. If you see this pie chart, you will see that Taiwan really takes the lion's share in terms of the chip market share, followed by South Korea, others, and China. And so it brings us to the latest really tense situation. The next slide, please, is following the U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit. We have witnessed the unprecedented escalation of military tension around Taiwan Strait. If you go on Commonwealth Magazine's website, you could see this wonderful interactive graphic story done by my excellent colleagues. And next slide, please. You will be able to see the how the military exercises were carried out near Taiwan Strait, and people were really getting their nerves on, but because the blockade situation could result in really difficulties in chip supply chains. If you remember from 2 years ago, even a year ago, there's been really difficulty in the auto industry in Europe. It was really difficult for some of the companies to get the chips they needed for production. So, well, when they see that there's so much concentration of chip manufacturing in Taiwan, many people are asking themselves, is this sustainable going forward? So that's why we are talking about the West and Taiwan today, because the situation surrounding the island could determine, well, whether everyone will have access to their smartphones or their super fast computers, your PS4s, your Nintendo Switches. So, yeah, this is a really interesting topic, and also very timely given that China is going to have its 20th People's Congress in a few weeks. So this is really interesting time. So, and we have an excellent panel here. So first of all, I would like to start with Zhusha. Given your extensive experience working in the European Parliament, I would like you to come from the European Union's perspective. Can you comment on the European Union's changing strategy about Taiwan and its implications? So please, Zhusha, floor is yours.
Thank you, Huang Yin. Thank you. And hello, good morning, good afternoon to everyone. I think my greetings didn't go through just a minute ago when you introduced me. So good to see you all, good to be with you all. And thanks for organizing this. Thank you for the work, also to Open Forum. It is really a pleasure to be here. And in the 7 minutes that I have, I will try to make one main argument and then to elaborate a little bit on the supporting points that I would bring to you to support my argument. So my main argument would be that Taiwan's profile across the EU has increased in the past 2 years, but a clear strategy on what role the EU is ready and willing to play in a military contingency in the Taiwan Strait is still work in progress. So I argue that the EU must start seeing Taiwan through a security lens, in addition to a democracy and trade lens that it has at the moment. And that means that the EU should see Taiwan not only as a like-minded partner, but a vital partner. So 3 points to support this argument is: first, just a few remarks on the current state of affairs in EU-Taiwan relations. Second, I'll comment on the significance of these dynamics, and also what I think is needed to help see Taiwan indeed as a vital partner, not just a like-minded partner. So first, to begin with, so the EU now refers to Taiwan as a like-minded partner through the lens of democracy and this trade relationship that the two sides have. And Taiwan's place in the European discourse is right now being normalized, I would say, which is supported by parliamentary diplomacy to a great extent, which is not a new development, but it is a development that has gained increasing strategic value. This has happened in the context of the EU's rethink of its China policy and its emerging awareness of the Indo-Pacific. But at the same time, the EU's turn toward Taiwan is limited by the same factor, the China factor, because there are clear boundaries to how far member states are willing to go when it comes to engaging Taiwan. There is a one China of them. And at the same time, there is no interest in abandoning the Chinese market. There's a strong interest in rebalancing ties with China. And this is where Taiwan's relevance has increased. So the EU's strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific recognizes that the display of force in the Taiwan Strait may have a direct impact on European security and prosperity. This is the strategy that was published last September. And I think in terms of perceptions, there's also a pretty tangible contrast between how many in Europe see the People's Republic of China versus Taiwan. So I think to many in Europe, Taiwan has become everything that the PRC is not, which is counter to Beijing's calculations, I believe. So we have just recently, of course, in the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the response and the solidarity pouring out of Taiwan is in stark contrast with the lack of condemnation from Beijing of Moscow's war against Ukraine. But this is just the recent element, because in the whole pandemic management, bottom-up, transparent, as opposed to the non-transparent way or mismanagement of the pandemic, also sharpened views in Europe and also amplified these dynamics. So point number 2 is, what is the significance of these dynamics? Well, in my view, it is a sign that there's a higher awareness clearly of Taiwan's relevance, not just of Taiwan as an entity, as a country, which is not exactly how it goes down in the European discourse, but as Taiwan's relevance to the EU's geopolitical ambitions, and a stronger willingness to engage Taiwan and also to resist Beijing's objection to engaging Taiwan. I think this is a new development and much more tangible than 2-3 years ago. And it was accelerated by the Beijing support to Moscow, as I mentioned, in its invasion of Ukraine. And also on the trade front, the zero COVID policy and the impact on European businesses is also sharpening the rhetoric, because just recently I read the head of the European Chamber of Commerce president saying that in China, in this zero COVID context, ideology trumps the economy. So things don't look very positive in EU-China relations in this regard. So there's a rethink and there's an expansion of cooperation with Taiwan. But as I said, there is no common approach. So final point on how to go forward, or where I see potential for strengthening this dynamic and keeping the momentum, is that, as I said, member states must see Taiwan as a vital partner. So see it as an unavoidable question, not an option to not deal with Taiwan, because there are common challenges, stating the obvious here, economic coercion, disinformation, both sides face to different degrees, same challenge, but this requires seeing Taiwan through the security lens. And there's 2 dimensions here: economic security and maritime security. And this requires strengthening resilience from the European side. So the Indo-Pacific strategy is a good start to identify areas of cooperation with Taiwan in terms of resilience, but also with other actors, other partners in the region. This helps strengthen the economic security, but also the maritime security question, which is also in the Indo-Pacific strategy, and strengthening cooperation with partners such as Japan, where the language on Taiwan is also changing, that Taiwan crisis is a Japan crisis. And this I take from the Japanese political discourse. So finally, I think another point where we need to pay attention to, and this goes perhaps both Taiwan to the EU and Taiwan, is communication. And because so far I really spoke of EU-Taiwan relations from a European perspective, as I am based now in Taipei, I follow the developments from here as a European, and it really is very useful to understand, what Europe's image is and how much people know of Europe. And this is also changing as things are changing inside Europe. But better communication in both sides is essential. I think inside Taiwan also, Taiwan needs to invest more in its strategic thinking on Europe, which needs hard work. But I think both sides need to work harder to increase their profile. So perhaps I will stop here, not to go over my time. But essentially, I would finish with just a conclusion that there is a change in the bilateral relationship, but I think also that there is a learning period that we're in with the EU in towards Taiwan, China, and in the Indo-Pacific, and also Taiwan is learning how to engage Europe. And I think we will hear more about the case of Lithuania, I'm sure, and yes, I'm happy to continue along these lines as we get to the exchange. So that's where I would stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jusha. I think I already hear a lot of really interesting points, including the EU should see Taiwan as a vital partner instead of just like-minded partner. And this leads me to think about probably a provocative question that maybe we can tackle later. So I think when it comes to like the defense of Taiwan in case of Chinese aggression, the US President Biden always get asked that question. So people always ask him, yeah, would the US come to Taiwan's aid if push comes to shove? I think maybe it's time for the EU to think about this question. And an interesting question would be, so who would be answerable, who would be responsible for coming up with an answer or response to that contingency? So that's something we can maybe talk about later. And now, for now, let's go to Vilnius. So Gigi, I think for the Taiwanese people, we were not really familiar with Lithuania. Very few people have traveled from Taiwan to Lithuania, but Lithuania, I think, since 1 or 2 years has been really a really nice topic for discussion in Taiwan, because there's so much support for Taiwan, and really the two countries are getting closer. Lithuania just established a trade and business representative office in Taipei, just opened a few weeks ago. And I had the pleasure of visiting Vilnius and also meeting with Gigi in Vilnius, exchanging really interesting conversations with you. So I would like to turn our give our stage to Gigi to talk about why it was important for Lithuania to get closer to Taiwan, and why is now the time. So Gigi, please.
Thank you so much. It will not be easy to explain it all in 7 minutes, but I have a proposal. In exactly in 3 weeks, I'm landing in Taiwan and will spend in Taipei 5 days. So we will continue with those who has some questions on Lithuania. Well, together we went to KGB prison in Vilnius, so you learned part of our story. But actually, if you see that night behind my back, our story started hundreds of years ago. Next January, we will celebrate 700 years of Vilnius. Vilnius was a capital of a very big country from Baltic to Black Sea. And actually, where Russians now have the biggest problems on Ukrainian territory, those were the borders of our Grand Duchy of Lithuania. What I wanted to say, we've been fighting for freedom in those territories for hundreds of years. And then by the end of 18th century, when we were, we became very close to Americans because 3 years after Americans adopted first constitution, we did it in our big empire. We wanted to be free like America because it was quite a freedom empire we had. And then we were killed by free monarchies. You can say autocratic regimes of 18th century, Russia, Austria, and Prussia. We fled to America. Until now, in America, I have 1/4 of my nation. Interesting, maybe similarity or links to you. And then we regained our independence in 20th century. And again, we fell a victim of occupation. Stalin and Hitler made a pact and annihilated us. Again, big wave of immigration to America. America never recognized our occupation. I was ambassador in Washington, D.C., and my embassy was functioning for 50 years of independence. America, Taiwan also never recognized our occupation. You've been supporting us. You don't know it, maybe, for those very difficult years of occupation. And finally, you should understand that while we disappeared from the maps of the world, because the West was then shaking hands with Stalin regime in Yalta. They made a deal with the devil. So we are the experts. We are the nation that know how much deals with devil costs to the nation. And then we were the first to revolt against the Soviet Union. I'm sitting in the parliament. That was like Tiananmen Square of Lithuania. I was 20 years old when Gorbachev came to Lithuania and said, you know, we don't want your independence. We will send tanks and kill you. Together we were at the TV tower where I was standing and they killed my friends from my own school. I saw it with my eyes. And then we gathered around the parliament and we defended that freedom. 100,000 of us, and we saw the Red Army stopping. And that was the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union. So when you ask Lithuanian why Taiwan, it's an interesting and strange question, because why not? We are like Taiwan. We were fighting against those autocratic regimes. And, now turning into modern history, when we saw our trade figures with Communist Republic of China, that created kind of format to enslave half of Europe, to cut us from the West, so-called 17+1, we understood that this is another little nice, strange communist plot to divide us from the West, to divide us from America. And we said goodbye. We left the format. Then China was very angry. We convinced other Baltics to do the same. Now you have 14+1. We know that Prague will be next. We hope Slovakia will be after them. We hope this format will be destroyed, because why should we fall into the new slavery of China that extends so far to our region? We had enough of Soviet slavery in this area. And we hope that democracies finally will start defending each other. We hope that the European Union will extend new trade links to Taiwan. And we hope that finally Taiwan, Lithuania, Ukrainian countries like this, we will be standing together in international organizations that will be United Nations of democracies, that will be fighting for freedom with every means they have. Because honestly to say, we are minority already. Free and democratic countries, we are minority. Freedom is under attack for at least 15, 17 consecutive years. Autocracies are marching, and they are marching today not only with slogans and propaganda, they are killing us, they are occupying us, And that's why we are supporting so much Ukrainians. And that's why I'm so happy that together with me, first time ever in your history, it will be Ukrainian MPs visiting Taiwan. We have to stand united. We have to fight for freedom united. Because if we do not wake up today, then you will face the fate of Ukrainians. You have to warn the free world that this is coming. You better wake up. You better wake up now before it's not too late. And then if you do it in time, if you, first of all, get all your money and technologies from autocracies, because you empower them with your own money. By the way, Taiwan is doing the same with China. This is another little point of discussion with you. Get rid of those autocracies. We have to fight for our world. We have to create our own free and democratic world. I would love TCMC to come to Vilnius. I would love your investments to come to Lithuania, because we have to strengthen each other instead of strengthening our enemies and finally killers. Thank you so much.
Wow. Thanks, Gigi, for the powerful opening speech. So it's really, I feel like you made a very important point, saying that the democracies should stand with each other and empower each other. I feel like in the world, so many places are becoming more and more polarized and extreme, and with a lot of misinformation, extremism going rampant. So this is really very important. And then you touched on a point that has to do with trade and investment. And as a business reporter, also very interested in those points, and we could probably get to those later. So last but not least, I would like to welcome Antoine. So since you're based in Paris, and I seem to know that France was one of the, or maybe the first EU country to come up with its own Indo-Pacific strategy. So I would like to ask Antoine to give us some insight into why that was important for France, and why was the timing relevant, and also what kind of role does Taiwan play in the French Indo-Pacific strategy? So I'll give the floor to Antoine, please.
Sure. Thank you very much, Kwang Yin. So to briefly introduce the French Indo-Pacific strategy, I think we must first, as you did, explain why France was the first European, not even EU, European country to lay out its Indo-Pacific strategy. I think that the most important explanation is that France differs from the other European countries because we have sovereignty interests in the Indo-Pacific, and we are what we call a fully fledged Indo-Pacific country. We have 7 out of our 13 overseas departments, regions and communities that are located in the Indo-Pacific, in the Indian Ocean, like Réunion, Mayotte, and what we call the French Southern and Antarctic lands, but also in the Pacific Ocean with New Caledonia, French Polynesia, Wallis and Futuna, and Clipperton. So it's also very important to underline that thanks to these territories, Réunion and Mayotte Islands are the only 2 what we call outermost regions of the EU in the Indo-Pacific area. So for the French, it's more than 1.6 million French people living on these territories in the Indo-Pacific, while an additional 500,000, 500,000 are living in foreign countries in the Indo-Pacific. So it's all about sovereignty interest. I'm not going to talk about our military display in the region. We have 5 military commands, 7,000 military personnel deployed on a permanent basis, and we have a broad network, diplomatic network, military network, etc. In the region, with some key French administration and institution being very much active in the region, and that's the case of the French Development Agency, what we call Agence Française de Développement, that is active actually in 24 countries in the Indo-Pacific, with a total investment stock of more than 10 billion euros. So the French Indo-Pacific strategy was first laid out in 2018 by President Macron on a visit to Australia. Mostly, it was in May 2018. But the initial, I would say, focus was mostly on these sovereignty issues, on these security issues, and explain you why the Ministry of Armed Forces was the first one actually to present its own strategy, the security strategy for the Indo-Pacific, and it was in 2019. Then the Ministry of Foreign Affairs followed suit with a first document called the Indo-Pacific Space, a priority for France. And then we appointed, and we were the first European country to do so, a special ambassador for the region, so an ambassador for the Indo-Pacific. He was appointed in September 2020. Christophe Penaud, it was our former special envoy to Malaysia and to Australia, and he has just been actually replaced by a new ambassador who used to be our ambassador to Singapore, that will take his functions in few weeks. And in July 2021, France released its strategy, and that is very specific because it's a governmental strategy. So it's not from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, not from the Ministry of Defense. So July 2021 is the government strategy. So how does Taiwan fit in that strategy? Initially, it did not really fit, to be honest, and the French government kept actually with the strategy of so-called invisibilizing Taiwan in all of the major French documents, be it the strategic update of the Ministry of Armed Forces in January 2021, be it in that Indo-Pacific strategy in July 2021. Taiwan was either not mentioned, even the Taiwan Strait was not mentioned as a hotspot, regional hotspot. But basically, the objective was to speak the least as possible of Taiwan. It started to change in 2021, in late 2021, due to public pressure. Some of us basically pointed out the incoherence of the French official communication, where basically we accept to openly talk about Taiwan in the G7 format at the EU level, because the EU strategy for cooperation that was published in September 2021 mentioned the Taiwan Strait, mentioned Taiwan as an economic and important partner. The French were willing to talk about Taiwan with some of our most important partners in the region, like Japan, like Australia, in the framework of the 2+2 dialogue. But in our own national documents, Taiwan was not mentioned. So it started to change in February 2022. The Taiwan Strait and Taiwan were more explicitly mentioned in the second version of the Indo-Pacific strategy. And I would say that France is in a period, in a sequence of normalizing at the highest level on Taiwan. At the non-official and non-governmental level, the French civil society and the French two chambers have been quite active. Some resolutions have been adopted in 2021 by both the National Assembly and the Senate to ask for a stronger participation of Taiwan in the international organization, something that was also pushed by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs publicly, be it at the WHO or publicly from the two chambers in Paris. So you had for many years kind of a dichotomy between the official position that was don't talk about Taiwan and kind of the civil society position that is, of course, we have interest in maintaining the status quo in the Taiwan Strait. We need to talk more about Taiwan. It does not mean a policy shift. It just means some more coherence between our interests and our communication. So I would say we are once again in a process of normalizing. For the very first time in August this year, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs started to tweet about Taiwan, something they had never done in 10 years, to tweet about the situation in the Taiwan Strait. The Minister of Foreign Affairs explicitly mentioned Taiwan in the first interview she gave to a daily newspaper, Libération. It was the end of August. And for the very first time, actually, President Macron, since he got elected in 2017, mentioned the Taiwan Strait and the tension in the Taiwan Strait in his speech to the ambassadors. So I would say there is a normalization in terms of communication. In terms of policy, it's too early to say. But what, of course, we need to aim for, and that's something we'll discuss with my two European colleagues, I'm sure, is how do we make sure that this normalization in terms of communication translates into a policy shift that will aim at something very basic, something very concrete, that is, how do we contribute to maintaining the status quo in the Taiwan Strait, because this is one of our top priority linked to our interest. And second, how do we keep increasing, strengthening, deepening cooperation with Taiwan in every single sector, economy, technology, culture, science, etc. All of us as EU member states are already doing a lot with Taiwan. We need to do much more. And I've been pushing for something very concrete and very simple for the last 2 or 3 years. The EU should join what we call the GCTF, the Global Cooperation and Training Framework, a framework of cooperation that was inaugurated by Taiwan and the US in 2015, that Japan joined in 2019 as a full member, that Australia joined in 2021. That's a framework of cooperation that some EU member states, or sometimes the EU, can join on a workshop, I would say, basis on some technical issues, but the EU should right now become a full member, a full participant to it. That's one concrete way to, once again, deepen cooperation and at the same time contribute to maintaining the status quo. Yeah, well.
Okay. Thank you, Antoine, for such comprehensive overview of the French strategy. If we could say that adjustment, and it's really been, you can see how it's evolved over the past few years. And I especially like one new vocabulary you mentioned, invisibilizing Taiwan. I think that has been the strategy adopted by a lot of countries, before. But I feel like from invisibilizing to normalizing, it's the new norm right now. So yeah, thank you for the great opening, Antoine. And next, I have a question for Gigi. So I am very interested as a business reporter. I'm always coming from the economy side of things. So as Zhuzha also mentioned in her opening remarks, there was a lot of economic interest from the EU nations in the Chinese market. And on the EU level, or where I am in Germany, I don't see, I think they're still going to continue maintaining their business interest in China. So it leaves a very interesting question for Lithuania. Why was Lithuania not reliant on the Chinese market? So by following, becoming much closer to Taiwan, what kind of impact does that have on the Lithuanian economy, and how are the businesses and people reacting to that development? So if you could enlighten us, Gigi.
Thank you so much. Well, it's sad to say, but we're used to economic coercion in this country. I remember when we declared independence in 90s, Russia, Soviet Union introduced all possible blockade for us. No gasoline, no nothing. We merely survived, but we survived. But on the other hand, we have that kind of resistance in our blood. The more the country bullies us, the more we resist. And China did the same. The same like Soviets, they were always doing with us. When we said that we simply don't like that divisive 17+1 format, because as my French colleague, we were calling for EU policy towards China. We want to have EU framework of dialogue with China and Taiwan, but we want to be a European policy to be developed, not allow those autocratic countries to divide and rule us like all empires do. China introduced after our revolts and when we left 17+1, they introduced all possible sanctions against us. All possible, I mean all possible. All direct trade links, everything was cut, but not only. They introduced indirect sanctions. They approached different European companies who has huge representation in Lithuania, and those who had links to China, they were asked not to develop those businesses. So China was trying to divide us and rule through economic community. We had companies who started to protest against that policy. We still have a difficult debate with opposition about that. The red opposition that was so much promoting relations with communist China. We have a liberal coalition right now, Christian Democrats and liberals mostly. So here my question to Taiwan, well, we support you wholeheartedly because you represent our values of, I don't know, you can say French Revolution or American Constitution. We are like you, but please consolidate our fight with your economic presence. Until now, if you would ask me, where are Taiwanese investments in Lithuania? I wouldn't be able to show a finger to point a finger to anywhere. We have 1 year of struggle for you, and we do not have your economic presence in Lithuania. And you should think about that. You should consolidate it. You should ask your businesses to do it like you did already in Czech Republic. You're quite present there, but they have a track record of relations with you for 2 decades or so. But you have to develop something fast. I understand that maybe there is a difference of political or economic cultures, but friends, brothers and sisters, we're living in the world where you have to react like this. You have to we have to learn to build strategies and not only be on reactive way. So build, an economic success in Lithuania. For those who still do business, big business with communist China, they would stop it. And here I would kind of provoke the discussion and just look to our neighbor Poland. Poland today is shaking hands with communist Beijing at the highest level. Foreign ministers meet and speak. Leaders meet and speak. They didn't leave the format 14+1. They are thinking to become a dose to communist Chinese money to the European Union, actually dividing us from inside as EU. Look to Hungary. Look to my dear little Hungary. Well, what's interesting happening there? They have the love story with China and Putin, actually. And this is something that makes me crazy. I was, accession negotiator of Lithuania. I turned, everything in this country to make it right. And some of our friends and brothers, they still play games with communist regimes. And I told it to my Polish brothers. My doctoral dissertation is about John Paul II. I told them that John Paul II would turn in his grave today, seeing his beloved Poland playing such games with communist China. So, well, for this, my dear brothers Taiwanese, I will meet you soon. I will come and see you. I will look to your eyes and ask, where are you economically in Lithuania? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Gigi. I hope the people in Taiwan are watching this, and I hope, well, even not right now, they will watch the playback of this. So, yeah, I really agree with Gigi in your remarks about the democratic countries should build strategies together, and we have to react quickly. And yeah, there is no better way to do it than having better communication. And I believe your trip in a few weeks in Taiwan will be a very interesting one. So I really hope you could look the important people in the eye and ask them, when is it that you're going to do something concrete? So speaking of investment, I have another question for Zhusha, coming from a business perspective. And even though I don't cover the semiconductor industry, but I could feel that the EU Chips Act is what a lot of people are talking about. So as because people right now, they realize how important TSMC is, how important the semiconductor industry from Taiwan is. There is really, I think, this urge from the EU level to boost domestic production of chips, given how much the supply chain was disrupted because of the pandemic and the lockdowns in China. So I would like to ask you, Zhisha, so how successful do you expect these efforts to be to boost European production of the chips? And also, what would the implications be for TSMC or the Taiwan semiconductor industry?
Yes, thank you, Kwang Yin. Thank you for the question. But if I may, and I think Antoine might want to also come back to the previous question we had, because I think that's a very important conversation when we look at the future of EU, Taiwan, as Gigi spoke of the Central Eastern European perception. And I just want to echo that a little bit as someone who comes from the region as well, how important it is to be very clear in what way Taiwan can be seen as a partner and how the perceptions can evolve. Because I think what is happening between Taiwan and Lithuania at the moment is going to set an example of how we can see Taiwan inside the region. So the 16+1, I agree, indeed, it was, or it has been, because it still exists as a 14+1 platform, it has been not exactly a platform or a cooperation framework that has benefited the individual member states. So I think in this context, where Lithuania and Taiwan go together, I think the responsibility lies on both sides. So I would like to echo that. And perhaps if we have other people who want to intervene on this question, because I think it's important. So perhaps I take your semiconductor question after this.
Later.
Antoine, you might want to comment. So we have a flow, if I may.
Yeah, sure. Please, Antoine.
Sure, I just wanted to go back on what Ziggy mentioned before. It's very important actually for Taiwan to not only invest more in the EU in general, but especially in Lithuania. And it's not, I would say, a competition among EU member states to receive the Taiwanese investment, but our Taiwanese friends need to understand that what you can do with Lithuania, you cannot do it with Germany. You cannot do it with France. You cannot even do it with Poland. I would say that Lithuania is a case study of an economy that is a strong economy, but a limited economy, I would say, relative in terms of size compared to Poland, to France, to Germany. So the impact that Taiwanese investment can have on the Lithuanian economy is massive. If you do 2 billion investment in Lithuania and 2 billion in France, of course, the consequences and the impact are completely different. So you have, I would say, a golden opportunity to demonstrate to EU member states that Taiwanese investments do impact, do have consequences, and that for these countries like Lithuania that suffered from Chinese economic coercion, there is a way, in a way, to mitigate the impacts of economic sanctions. And I've been advocating for many years to make sure that, to counter sanction is one thing. So the anti-coercion instrument is important, etc. But what matters also, it's a strategy of mitigating the impact of economic sanctions. To, as I call, to absorb the cost of economic sanction. You can call it a spawn strategy if you want. And the EU and EU member states have a role to play. And for sure, the European Commission accepted Lithuania to help the Lithuanian company that were being targeted by Chinese economic coercion. Some EU member states, including France, helped the French and European companies that were targeted by China. But we need to make sure also that Taiwan can play a role, that we all do that together, and that to counter economic coercion is something we can do together. It also works both way, I would say. Some agricultural products that Taiwan can no longer export to the mainland China could be exported to Europe, but that's something we need to discuss. And once again, the volume are very limited. So that's mostly about politics, that about economic competition or else. And if we fail on this kind of very, I would say, easy to solve economic issues, then for the bigger picture, it would be much more complicated. So once again, I really think that Lithuanians and Taiwanese should make sure to invest in Lithuania and demonstrate once again the commitment to forge and to strengthen cooperation, including economic cooperation with some of the EU member states.
Well, thank you, Antoine, for the excellent points. And I could see Gigi was giving thumbs up and nodding away. So these are really powerful points. And I really think this is a really refreshing point of view, especially for the Taiwanese, because I think Taiwan needs to stop thinking itself as a small country or a small economy. So I think economy wise, it's actually, like I said, punching above its weight, and it could create more impact than it believes that it can. So we have to stop thinking we're small, because I think in the past, for the longest time, Taiwan has always been really happy to be like the second in line. So the Taiwanese businesses are very good at following, copying, scaling up instead of creating. Imagine itself to be in leading position to create impact, because Taiwan really doesn't feel comfortable being on the spotlight. We have always been low key, quietly making money, and just copying and not being on the spotlight. But I think it's maybe time for Taiwan to emerge from the darkness and try to take a leading role. And like Antoine and Gigi suggested, try to make some impact by actively and also proactively working together with our partners, vital partners, and taking this further. So yes, let's come back, if we may, to the CHIPS Act question. Unless Gigi has some other points to add, give you 30 seconds.
Yeah, just on small, we are not so small actually. We are part of a EU market. So if you build a good business in Vilnius, usually we do the Baltic business. Those are Baltic companies. Those are Baltic Polish. Those are Baltic Nordic Polish companies. It's just a landing spot, that is very similar to you by values. And also look to the east. What might happen in the east during the winter? Empire might collapse. I saw one empire collapsing in front of my eyes. And look to 10 million market in Belarus. Look to 40 million huge market in Ukraine that will one day actually will become part of EU. My God, all the doors are from Vilnius. Look to Russia. One day who will make business in those territories? Us. And thank you, Taiwan, for sanctioning Russia by chips. That was one of the most powerful sanctions after, sanctions against Russian central bank. So we are already fighting on the territories of the future world that will be opened. And, land in Vilnius and you will be part of the future.
Well, thank you, Gigi. And it's a nice segue, since you talked about the chip sanction. So I really would like to hear from Jusha, your take on the CHIPS Act and how successful do you expect it to be?
Yes, thank you, Kwang Yin. I'm glad we had that conversation on the Lithuania-Taiwan future. I felt that there was more that needed to be said. So on the CHIPS Act, I think, again, we need to look at it in the context of this rethink from the European perspective of vulnerabilities and resilience in the context of the post-pandemic context, and also the relationship with China and our dependencies. So the European CHIPS Act should not be seen as a way to make ourselves independent, because I don't think any country can be fully independent in terms of semiconductors. And clearly the EU at this stage is at about 10% of the global share of semiconductor capacity. And the idea with the CHIPS Act is to increase this with an initial 43 billion investment to 20% of the global share, and then to match this with an additional private-public mobilization to the double of the 43%. So that's a bit of the numbers, but someone might point out, well, that's perhaps too little too late, because if you think of how much South Korea invests in its own semiconductor industry, that's 450 billion from what I'm reading. So that puts things into perspective. But to come back to the European idea of having a common approach and also a European control over chips, our chips capacity, I think is important to see this CHIPS Act as signaling a European will to address our shortage problems that we face, but also our capacity to produce. So it has actually three pillars in terms of pre-production, production, and as well as having a system that allows us to identify shortages. And how do we work in the case of a shortage? How do we coordinate with other partners? So in this regard, it is something that is expected to help European strategic autonomy in the sense, again, as I said, to boost our resilience, our independence, but not to provide, there's no expectation that this is something that will provide in a 10-year period of time or 20 years to catch up with other countries that are much more advanced. And as I said, again, as I did some research on this recently, it's quite mind-blowing. Just allow me, if you don't mind, looking at this information that I came across is that chip making from design to production, assembly, testing, and packaging is comprised of over 1,000 steps using around 300 materials, and it relies up to 16,000 suppliers worldwide. So this is the whole infrastructure of producing semiconductors. So the idea is to invest in innovation in pre-production, production, but also the signaling that European member states are giving to other countries that we are working towards a common approach. And I think this is something that Antoine also mentioned in terms of the anti-coercion instrument or other instruments that are there to defend our own interests. So staying, and that's also the concept of open strategic autonomy, if you will, which is that Europe remains open for business, but we need to rethink how we do business. So that is very important, I think, on the sidelines of the CHIPS Act. I prefer not to go into technical details because I admit I'm not a CHIPS expert, but clearly you started this panel with your presentation on TSMC and the relevance of TSMC. So there is interest in cooperating closer with TSMC and Taiwanese partners. And I think there's great value in there. And I think we need to see more of that also within Lithuania, because any investment in any one single member state actually contributes to the European capacity building. So what on the last point perhaps is, I think, where Taiwan does remain sensitive, to put it simply, in the European context. It's not, even I claim and I still argue that Taiwan's profile has increased, but Taiwan remains a difficult issue to tackle. That's why we don't have a joint approach. We don't agree on how far, how fast, and where we should go. Therefore, coming up with new initiatives is always going to be more difficult than embracing or bringing Taiwan into existing platforms. So Antoine mentioned the GCTF, that is a good example, but there are other international platforms where global supply chains are being discussed. And I think that's a good way to go forward also with Taiwan. So perhaps
Mhm.
I stop here.
Well, thank you, Jusha. I cannot agree with you more on the open strategic economy approach. And I think we see a clear trend, um, is that people, it's a learning process for many of us. For many of the members of the European Union, they're starting to learn how important Taiwan is. And so awareness, I believe, is really the first step to further action, strategy, formalizing, and also for the Taiwanese, it's also a learning process. But I admit that we have to learn faster, and we also have to react faster, because awareness that uh, Europe is a strategic partner that's reliable and that's democratic, it's very vital. But what's more important is where do we go going forward? So okay, I think it's about time that we take questions from the audience, and we already have quite a few questions coming in. So I think Antoine would be the person to answer the question. So we are going to combine two questions. So it's about recognition. So one of the question is, why do some countries not recognize Taiwan's sovereign stature, and what could be done? And also, what's the G7's outlook as a whole on Taiwan? So if Antoine could kindly answer these questions.
Sure, I will start with the G7. There has been a huge evolution over the last 18 months. In June 2021, for the very first time, the G7 agreed to mention Taiwan and the Taiwan Strait in the G7 statement. It was in the UK. And in early August this year, for the very first time, the G7 issued a statement on Taiwan, so fully on Taiwan. So there has been a huge shift, I would say, in the way the G7 communicates. And we have found, in a way, the consensus in terms of the narrative we use to make sure that we all agree on that statement. And just to get into diplomatic details, there is a very specific sentence that we had to work on to make sure that the 7 plus the EU could agree. And I will read it. That is, there is no change in the respective One China policies where applicable and basic position on Taiwan of the G7 members. So the where applicable might sound a little bit weird. It's actually because the Japanese officially do not use a One China policy. So it was a way to get the consensus and the agreement, even of Tokyo, on that statement. So we can find agreement. There is ways, and our diplomats, of course, are innovative enough in terms of drafting element langage, drafting narrative, to find ways in which we can all gather and push a strong message that is, we care about what's going on in the Taiwan Strait, and we are supportive of maintaining the status quo. So I would say that on the G7 level, it's very important. And it highlights something that, of course, China is fully opposed to, that the coordination, the growing coordination among G7 and G7 plus countries on Taiwan. Once again, we need to frame it as something positive. This is not against China. This is for Taiwan. And that's quite important. That's not an anti-China statement. And we don't even care about China when we talk about that. It's about Taiwan, about maintaining the status quo, about the Taiwanese people, etc. Second question on the recognition. On that, I would say that the opposite. Do we recognize officially the Taiwanese sovereignty? We don't say that explicitly, to be clear. But there is way when you call Taiwan a country, what many EU country and EU officials do, when you want Taiwan to participate in a way. What matters is not for us to say that Taiwan is sovereign or to say it explicitly this way, but is to say that we don't recognize that Taiwan is part of the PRC. I would say that the negative assurance that the Taiwan status is complicated, and the best for us, in a way, is not to talk about it. But at the same time, to recognize that Taiwan is not part of the PRC, that we do not say that Taiwan is part of the PRC. And in a way, that's very important to counter the Chinese narrative that equals the one China principle, the term that is being used in Beijing, with the 2758 resolution of 1971, and to make sure that this is not the same thing. The 2758 resolution in 1971 at the the General Assembly of the UN did not mention the status of Taiwan. So we need to be very clear and counter, I would say, the Chinese narrative. That's not something that our government can do. You're not going to have the G7 saying that the 2758 resolution is different from the One China principle, etc. That's not the job of the diplomats, but that's up to the civil society. So we need, in a way, to raise awareness and to do the Taiwan literacy in Europe on the differences between One China policy and One China principle, between the One China principle and the 2758 resolution, etc. And that's something in which the MPs, the civil society, the experts, the journalists, etc., have a key role to play. So I would say the question is not the one of the status of Taiwan per se, but to make sure that people do not start believing the Chinese narrative, that is that Taiwan is part of the PRC, and that we should basically be forced to follow that Chinese position.
Thank you for your point, Antoine. I especially like the necessity of Taiwan literacy, which I believe that Taiwan also needs EU literacy for that matter. And I believe Zhusha would like to follow up on Antoine's remarks. So it's yours.
Yes, I just think it's very important to dwell a little bit on this anti-China language that Beijing often uses to describe gestures or measures that Europeans or democracies do that protect their democracy in the face of authoritarian threats. So I think the EU is not doing enough to counter that narrative. In the case of Lithuania, and Zygmantas, you can perhaps jump in if you wish, but the way I read Lithuania's move away from China and closer to Taiwan is not because, to begin with, Lithuania is anti-China. Lithuania is pro-Europe, in my reading, and is pro-Taiwan. So it's very important to not allow any space for Beijing to sell or to promote, or not to promote, but to talk about our way of doing as much as we can to promote our own interests and to defend our democracy as anti-China. And because if you read communications coming out for years from Beijing, this anti-China specific term has been used very often. So I think we should be doing more to communicate well. And this goes back to also the CHIPS Act. Why are we doing this? Why are we doing an anti-coercion instrument? Not because we're obsessed with being anti-China, but we are looking out after our own interests, because that's what China does. That's what any country would do. And but yes, I think I made my point clear. So I mean, I hope, but that's just something I wanted to highlight.
Yeah, thank you, Zhusha. I think it's really important not to fall into the traps of antagonistic framing of language. So I think that's actually a very important point to make. So we do things not because we're anti-China, but because we're looking out on our own interests and because we're pro-democracy, pro-values. And I believe Gigi would like to make a few comments on Zhusha's point. Gigi is muted.
Yeah, sorry. I will maybe provoke the discussion a bit because, you know, when you live on the front lines of freedom, when you have just 30 kilometers from here regimes who kill people because they think differently, sometimes you speak a bit more radically. I think when I look to my European friends, they are making this Russian mistake with China. You know, I was deputy foreign minister, 23 years I was Lithuanian diplomat who was going to Paris, to Berlin, to Brussels and praying asking them, please decouple from Putin's regime. Don't allow the regime to build its economic power with your technologies and markets at the same time when they kill democracy inside the country. Because sooner or later, tanks will roll on. And nothing of this happened. I remember Russia invading Georgia, this famous Sarkozy agreement, well, I'm trying to stay diplomatic. Nothing of it is no sanctions of Putin when it was the Munich of 21st century. So you can say or look to Bucharest NATO summit, not enlarging our, NATO to Ukraine. So signaling weakness to autocracies and pouring money to Russia provoked the wars. But Europeans are doing the same with China. Look to all the trade figures today. Main partner is China, if overall trade. And I was just in Sweden. They were asking me, Gigi, so one day the conflict will start. What we will do with all our Volvos? Well, I said, think about this today, because it will be one day, sometime in the future, when you will have to decouple from China in one night, like it happened with Russia. And then don't cry, Argentina, when you see Nord Stream exploding. We told you 20 years before you did all those stupid mistakes. So take your money from autocracies, invest into democracies, build that Indo-Pacific democratic world that French and Americans want to build. We will happily join it. Actually, our trade with this world grows now dramatically with democratic Indo-Pacific world. We are happy that actually French and Americans are opening the doors for little Lithuanian economy, not so little already, to enter those. So decouple from autocracies, before it's not too late. Don't make a Russian mistake with China.
Thank you, Gigi. Always very passionate. And I believe that yesterday, so a member of the audience submitted a video question. So if Gaurav can play that video now for our panelists.
I have a question for you. Can Taiwan be the trigger point for the Third World War? If yes, to what extent?
Yes, a very difficult question. Could Taiwan be the trigger of a Third World War? And I believe also in the comments section, somebody was asking, if that's the case, why is the world not really talking about it? So yes, Gigi, thank you. If you could answer this question.
Because it's kind of continuation of what I said. All the strategists told, if you want to live in peace, prepare for the war. Don't be afraid of it. And vice versa. If you think by making Taiwan invisible, you will create peace, it's wrong. Weakness provokes autocracies to attack democracies. Be very clear. We are now fighting, and we will be fighting in all NATO capitals for NATO enlargement to Ukraine. The thing that was not done and provoked the war in 2008. We are so glad that EU extended candidate status to Ukraine. We will now fight for accession talks to start with Ukrainians. We don't want to, another Balkan experience to repeat. But here I come to sensitive question. In Lithuania, Taiwan is called Taiwan. It is Taiwanese representation. And we made it because we thought the things should be made very clear. You have to draw the line to autocracies before they invade the country. So I was asking in Assemblée Nationale the same question. When you will call Taipei representation a Taiwanese in Paris? When will be done the same in Washington, D.C.? The Senate is calling for it. We have a Senate Foreign Affairs Committee resolution on that. Be brave, draw the line, because if you don't draw the line, this line will be driven by the autocracies, and then we will all pay so much that it will be too late to think. So better listen to what those little Lithuanians are telling to you living on the front lines of democracy.
Well, thank you, Gigi. And since you were speaking about Ukraine, we do have a few questions about Ukraine, and this is one that's also related to Taiwan, and I would ask Jusha to comment on that. So the question is, what is the repercussion on Taiwan's Ukraine stance? What's your observation? Yeah, I think you also have, you just taught a class this morning about Ukraine. So I believe you could make a few comments on that.
Yes, thank you for the question. And I guess I'm in the privileged position here because I'm in Taipei and I've been here since February, observing things unfold in Europe, with great anxiety, but also encouraged by the level of understanding of the gravity of the situation in Ukraine, inside Taiwan. I think there was a level of awareness that Taiwan cannot be on the sidelines of it, but needs to participate in efforts in Ukraine and in Europe to deter further aggression or to participate in relief efforts. So I was very touched when I saw that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Taiwan opened this possibility for Taiwanese people to raise funds and companies to participate and to support the relief efforts in Central Eastern European countries that were receiving Ukrainian refugees. And I think this was very important for Taiwan to recognize that this was something that it had to do, not out of obligation, but it was a natural thing to do. And I think it follows up to what Taiwan did with the mask diplomacy earlier on in the pandemic, which was then reciprocated by some Central Eastern European countries with the vaccine diplomacy. So I think this is very important in this two-way partnership that we see evolve and strengthen between Taiwan and certain EU member states. And I think what we see again with Lithuania, I think is important. I also think that there's room to speed up and to bring substance to it. But what we need to see, and I think Huang Yin, you said it, that not we, but Taiwan needs to think of itself, stop thinking of itself as a small, I'm not sure exactly what you used, but as a country that can contribute and that is indeed a partner. So it is important from the perspective of Taiwanese identity and Taiwan's aligning itself with other democracies that are Taiwan's partners inside Europe, and also when it comes to the sanctions, to take that position. So this is my observation, and I think it does contribute to that increased visibility and understanding inside Europe of Taiwan, which, as I said earlier, in the context of communication, is very important because there's a lot of work that Taiwan needs to do inside Europe. So that's what I would say on the Ukraine-Taiwan question, and also how much it has contributed to the understanding inside Taiwan of their own readiness to defend themselves. I think it did bring that challenge closer. So we see more civil initiatives to focus on civil preparedness. And I think this is very important within the Taiwan-China context. So perhaps I stop here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so thank you, Jusha. Yes, so Ukraine was indeed and has been a topic of debate for a lot of people in Taiwan, the politicians. Yeah, some of them would like to say that, yes, Taiwan is like Ukraine, but I think more of them would prefer to not to compare Taiwan to Ukraine because I do think the politicians don't want to play up people's fear. But I do I agree with you, Jusha, that Taiwanese people need to think more about these issues and act upon them. Okay, so I'll come back to Antoine. So I actually have a question for you, and it could be a little bit provocative. So we're coming from really a time when there is really unprecedented interest from the EU countries, or Western countries, if you like, in Taiwan. So we have numerous delegations from the EU countries and also from the US going to Taiwan for nice visits. So some of the discussions I've heard from Taiwan and even also from Europe was that all this attention, is it necessarily a good thing for Taiwan? Because China is going to feel increasingly agitated. When these Western countries are getting closer to Taiwan, paying more attention, doing business. What do you think? And some people are even saying that this could give Taiwanese people wrong expectations, such as, oh, the European Union will come to our aid when push comes to shove, when in reality that might not happen. So what's your comment on that? I would like to hear from you, Antoine.
Sure. First, yeah, there has been an unprecedented coverage on Taiwan starting 2-3 years ago. Not so much because of the tension in the strait initially, but because of the COVID-19 pandemic and the way Taiwan actually faced it and successfully managed to handle the pandemic. Second, there is a growing attention, sure, at the political level included, from our MPs. But the parliamentary visit to Taiwan are something that is very frequent, normal. At the French level, we've had actually parliamentary visit every single year for the last 20 years. So when people, try to compare it or try to explain that this is because Pelosi visited Taiwan, that the French MPs or other MPs are willing to visit Taiwan, no. And it's not a provocation to visit Taiwan. The provocation would be not to visit Taiwan because the Chinese decide overnight that we should not go to Taiwan anymore when we've been going for decades. So I think we need to be very clear on that this is business as usual, and that we will not give in in a way to cave in to Chinese pressure. The expectation, yes, we need to manage expectation, of course, in the two, I would say, on both sides, be it in the EU or in Taiwan. But I think that Taiwan is, especially the government, is fully aware of the limited capacity of the EU and the Europeans when it comes to security and military issues. And that's why I keep repeating that, the biggest role that the European can play is not when there is a conflict. And if there is one lesson to be learned from Ukraine, is not about the sanction against Russia, it's not about the consequences, is that we failed in deterring Russia to invade Ukraine. And the main lesson is, how do we make sure that we keep deterring China through various means? And the Europeans, of course, can play the economic card, the diplomatic card, etc. We convince China not to invade Taiwan, and we make sure that we contribute in maintaining the status quo. I think this is one of the biggest role that the Europeans can play. And in terms of bilateral cooperation between Europe and Taiwan, we've been talking a lot about the values, and of course it matters. But the Europeans need to understand that a conflict in the Taiwan Strait would have much bigger and far-reaching economic consequences than the current war in Ukraine, that already have huge economic consequences that we feel every single day. Because of the Taiwanese, I would say, position in the global supply chain we mentioned earlier, because of the Taiwan geographical position at the heart of maritime global trade, etc., the consequences would be tremendous. So this is in the European interest to do more, not once again against China, but to do more for Taiwan, for the status quo. And in terms of declaratory diplomacy and else, to convince China that it's not in their interest to change the status quo, and that we keep basically the status quo.
Thank you, Antoine, for again the powerful points that you made. So as we are almost time for the panel discussion, I believe that Gigi has some points to make so about the international organizations. So please, Gigi, and well, maybe for the before we conclude our panel discussion for today.
Thank you so much. I really wanted, first of all, also to agree very much with Antoine on this parliamentary cooperation. But as with economic kind of cooperation, Taiwan should be more active with countries like Lithuania. The same should be said about this parliamentary level. For example, my speaker is thinking about a European visit of speakers of parliament to Taiwan. I would love to have French Senate speaker to join my speaker. We are good friends. He was here in Vilnius. We took decision on joining Mali operation. The world is so small today. Actually, we have to stand together. So let's build that delegation, or maybe let's invent new formats of cooperation. I'm a member of Foreign Affairs Committee. We have a lot of formats, Nordic Baltics. Why don't we think about new format? For example, Nordic Baltic, Taiwan, Japan, America. Let's make it regular. Taiwan has to be creative with those formats. And finally, I come to the most difficult question, yes, about international organizations. Today, and I'm looking to Antoine, to other countries who, after Second World War, created this post-Cold War II, institutions. They are not working today enough to defend democracies. They are hijacked by autocracies. You have two criminal or communist regimes who sit in Security Council and actually block everything that is, directed towards democracy. So what do we do with this? Do we have an infrastructure of international infrastructure where we speak Taiwan together or speak China together? We don't even have it in EU. We don't have EU-China format. We thought maybe French presidency, created, but it didn't. We thought maybe Czechs. Now we will ask the Swedes. We don't have EU meet with China where we think China together. But the same said on international level. I was ambassador at large for democracy for some time in Lithuania. I had Hillary Clinton here in Vilnius, and we were speaking with her. What about United Nations of Democracy? What about turning those meetings of Ramstein, where our defense ministers meet together with Ukrainian, into international organization that will defend democracy? Because you know what, Antoine? This is just the beginning. This is just the beginning. Before it was Belarus, that is imprisoned and killed as freedom. Now it's Ukraine. If we do nothing, it will be Lithuania and Baltic states. We will be under attack. Democracies will be under attack globally. Autocracies are coming. And, look to our population figures, look to our economic figures. Free world will be minority. We have to find instruments to create new institutions to defend democracy. And we don't have it. We are hijacked by autocracies. This is a big problem. Thank you.
Well, Gigi, ending on a very powerful note here. So, well, to conclude, I have a few really takeaways from today's excellent discussion. So, big thanks to the panelists for joining us from different corners of the world. Yusha in Taipei, Gigi in Vilnius, and Antoine in Paris. So, a few points I think it's important that we see that the trend in the EU countries is to normalize the discussion about Taiwan and relations with Taiwan. That's very important. And literacy goes both ways. Taiwan literacy in EU and EU literacy for the Taiwanese is equally important. And I also very much like Gigi's proposal, the idea, the United Nations of democracies, because as we are witnessing in even the EU countries or America, we can see a lot of extremist ideas. They're flourishing. Yeah, it seems like that's where we're going, but democracies have to come together, and we have to be stronger. So, well, to conclude today's panel discussion, round of applause for everyone involved, and thank you, Gaurav, our tech expert. So, you're welcome to follow us online. If you use Twitter, you go to @the_open_forum. Yes, here it is. So for the playback, I believe you could also check Facebook. You can also use YouTube for the playback of today's event. And if you have any feedback or questions, follow-up questions, you're welcome to email us, send us a message, or you could find me on a Commonwealth magazine. We're on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, everywhere. So I believe there will be the link to the playback sometime later this week. So for now, I would like to thank all of you, Jusha, Gigi, and Antoine. And I hope all of you enjoy a fruitful day or an evening wherever you are. So come back to the open floor discussions in the future. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening, good morning to some of you.
Bye. See you in Taiwan.
Okay, bye-bye. See ya.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a good day. See you.
Thank you.
Bye.